You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
It's the final countdown. All right, Matt. I'm back on Shoe and Show. I've been off for a couple of weeks. We're back to it. We've been all over the place.
A call out to Europe, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct, and we will get to that. But first, we were in Portland, Oregon not long ago and had a bang-up event. We had the Sustainability Summit, which had nearly 200 folks. We had the Brews and Shoes, which had nearly 250 folks. And then the next day we had the Logistics Summit, which had nearly 100 shoe supply chain executives. So for all the folks who were out in Portland, thank you for coming out. The feedback was amazing. The energy was amazing. The content was amazing. It felt really good to get people together. If you weren't there, we're doing it again next year. We're going to just recycle it. It's
well played.
Like what I'm saying there. So we'll recycle it. New content, new speakers, obviously, new themes. But I was asking someone the other day. I was like, is there, in terms of sustainability, can we do a summit every year? And they were like, everything changes every day, right? Yeah. So, like, yes, you can do.
It's totally sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. So, and one of our keynote speakers at the Sustainability Summit was from Bloom. They focused specifically on water issues, which I thought was fascinating, and they got a huge response from people who, I think most of the industry is looking at carbon issues and looking at greenhouse gas emission issues, which is exactly right in many ways. But we're getting to the point where we have to start to look beyond just that and look at larger environmental issues and impacts and measure those. And so that's why I was leading in with the Europe song, because Europe is leading the way in this, and they're far, far more advanced than most states in the U.S. And certainly the federal government. But it gives us foreshadowing to what we might see here. So we wanted to bring on a guest in the keynote that we had at the Sustainability Summit to kind of shed some light on that and help people out.
Yeah, that's right. So Ashton Zeller, who's the chief scientist at Bloom Sustainable Materials, gave that keynote that you mentioned, Andy. And I was there. You could hear a pin drop with some of the stats that he was unveiling on water usage and the availability of water. And so we've had almost 400 episodes. I think we've had a scientist on like a handful of times. You can count it on one hand. So I'm super excited to just learn more and engage with Ashton on these really critically important issues. So Ashton, welcome to Shoe and Show. First and foremost, just give us an intro. Like, what on earth is a chief scientist at a company like Bloom? What's your day to day?
So Bloom is a startup, so my day to day involves a lot of things. But I engage with product development. I engage with sustainability for our organization, looking at LCAs, both of materials we source and putting together our LCA. I've been trained on the greenhouse gas protocol standard. I'm also fairly involved in industry in the marketplace. So I'm on the FRAG advisory panel for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directives ESRS development, which is the standards that they use for those reporting schemes, as well as involved with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and their ecosystem restoration efforts around the globe. So kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of things, but if it ends up asking some technical questions, I normally get pulled into the room.
Let's jump into it, because I think you said it. You're sitting on some of these panels that are looking at how policymakers can enact law that deal with impact assessments and reporting, and how that would look. And in particular, we know the CSRD, and I want to slow it down because there's a lot of acronyms here, but the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that is in the European Union passed. It builds upon old financial disclosures, and it adds in environmental standards to those. And I know, most major European countries have reported on this in the past in a different way, but now will go forward reporting on their environmental impacts. What some companies don't realize, I think, that aren't European based or have a heavy presence, is that eventually, over several years, nearly every company that sells product in Europe will have to comply with these rules. And so we just want to bring you on today to kind of talk a little bit about the directive so people can start to prepare. This is kind of like making people aware. I don't think many footwear companies in the U.S., especially U.S. based companies, are aware that this has been enacted. And then, and furtherance to that too, the rules on how you measure and how you report just passed. So there is guidance. There's not people aren't out in space trying to figure out where they're going. There's a clear there's clear rules on what they need to do. So maybe you can just quickly share the background behind this and kind of some of the key points to help people get their mind around what's coming.
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head. The CSRD follows up on the non-financial reporting directives that the European Union passed some years ago. They passed that directive, and it was entirely voluntary. And what they found is that it was voluntary, but nobody in industry was actually doing it. So they said, okay, we can't make it voluntary. We got to make it mandatory. So that's where the corporate sustainability reporting directive comes from, is the mandatory legislation. As you said, this has gone through the legislative process already. It's been reviewed by the EU Parliament multiple times. The agnostic standard is what is out today. The industry specific standards still are not out. So the difference between those two is the agnostic standard is something that every business will have to report against, regardless what industry they're in. But then there are also industry specific standards where FRAG and other entities are looking at various industries and saying, okay, what is critically important to this industry? What are the biggest challenges in sustainability in this industry? And let's ask for more detailed reporting for that industry based on its specific needs. So those have not been approved by EU Parliament and passed yet. But the agnostic standard was passed some months ago. There was some back and forth about whether everything should be mandatory or not. There was still this push for it to be voluntary. But just within the past couple of weeks, the EU Parliament said, nope, it's going to be mandatory under the double materiality standard, which is a standard that asks, are the impacts financially impactful and environmentally impactful? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then you must report on them.
And then I do want to point out this really quickly. The double materiality is clever because it basically questions whether when you make a product, if it has an impact. And I think it's obvious if you make anything, if you take any raw material and make it into something else, there's an impact. So it's kind of this catch-all where it's not saying, and in these rules too, there's not targets. It's not saying this is sustainable and this isn't. But these laws are basically saying if you have an impact by making a product or you're shipping it or you're providing a service, there is an impact. So we're not forcing you. But by the way, if you say that there's not an impact and someone questions that, you can get into a lot of trouble.
No, absolutely. And so there is a third-party auditing scheme with these reports. So you're going to have to defend whatever position you take. So you're 100% right. If you're a company that manufactures a product, it's going to be really hard to claim that your product has no material impacts, right? The inherent production of products generally leads to material impacts. That's not to say somebody won't try to make that claim, but if you're going to make that claim, you got to have the data one way or the other, because you got to be able to back up that claim, because there is a third party auditing scheme. And so if you're going to make the claim that your impacts aren't material, you still have to have the data that backs that up. So they're basically requiring companies to start gathering sustainability data, whether they're going to report on it to the public or not, because they're either going to have to defend their position that they don't need to report, or they're going to have to actually report. So it creates this clever regulatory environment where it's kind of mandatory, but not strictly mandatory. And also allows, consulting companies or companies that provide services and don't have products, the ability to not have this huge burden on collecting data around a non-existent product.
Yeah, our industry, Ashton, is very used to using third-party audit protocols for chemical safety and for social compliance, and so that's not a foreign relationship in the minds of our C-suite execs for sure. But what might be foreign are some of these terms and ways to prepare. So as you are advising your clients and our listeners on how to prepare for this, what that information gathering looks like, what is an LCA? Walk us through some of these key components that our executives need to be aware of. We know our operators in the sustainability space are keenly aware of them, but what are some of the things that our C-suite need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so the corporate sustainability reporting directive is a combination of qualitative and quantitative assessments in 5 environmental categories. So there's also a social and a governance aspect of this. And for that, you're probably not going to want to talk to the scientist because that's not my area of expertise. But as it relates to the environmental stuff, there's a climate change category, a pollution category, water and marine resources category, a biodiversity and ecosystems category, and a resource use and circular economy category. So what is mandatory is the general disclosure. It doesn't matter what kind of business you are, you have to make a general disclosure saying, this is the sustainability impact of my organization. This is what I view as being important to sustainability in my organization. This is my plan for making my business more sustainable. And it's a list of mostly qualitative statements about your business and how your business is tackling sustainability. But then beyond that, each of the other 5 categories, you have to determine whether your business has a material impact on those categories of sustainable impacts. And so, as we already discussed, if you make a product, chances are you probably have a material impact. So, from there, they're looking for, qualitative statements. What's my plan to address this? What incentives am I providing within my organization for my employees to improve in regard to this? What policies do I have to prevent causing problems with this? But then there's also quantitative assessments. So things like, what are your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? What is your kilograms of CO2 emissions per revenue? So all of these kind of quantitative measures that, as you said, come from something like an LCA. And so it's creating this scheme where organizations are required to go out and gather intel about the products that they make, the raw materials used in those products, the processes used in those products, so that they can then make company organization level statements about their business and what actions their business is taking to improve what they do on a daily basis.
Can you talk more about what an LCA is? Give us like a 30 to 1 minute answer on LCA 101.
Well, I'll try to be less than 30
Go.
minutes, but yeah, so LCA is a life cycle assessment. It looks at a product all the way from its original extraction from natural resources all the way to its end of life, and basically accounts for every single process, every single refinement step, every single elements that goes into that product, and looks at the impacts of those on a number of levels. The midpoint categories, I think there's like 20 something of them, but then all boils up to an endpoint category. And so the endpoint categories in an LCA are human health, ecosystems, resources, cumulative energy demand, climate change, and water use. You might notice that overlaps with the CSRD reporting categories, ecosystems, and then there's biodiversity and ecosystems in CSRD, water use, and then there's water and marine resources in CSRD, resource use, and then there's resources in LCA, and then there's resource use in circular economy in CSRD, and then climate change, and then there's climate change as well in CSRD. That's not by accident, that's intentional. The European Union has been very clear that they think that impact reporting and sustainability needs to be backed up by impact reporting. And they're using LCA as the foundation of what is going to drive their regulations and their reporting schemes.
We've also seen that with the green marketing directives that came out earlier this year, where they're basically starting to enforce if you make any green claims in European Union, you need to back it up with scientific data.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Life cycle oriented data.
right,
So they've said, hey, the world of just making a content claim is not going to exist in the future. You have to actually back up your product sustainability claim with impact related data.
yeah.
Um,
Here's the other thing too, and I think what a lot of companies look at, because if you look at product information on a website, you'll see different certifications that are listed on materials, whether it's GRS or some that's Textile Exchange or Leather Working Group, which focuses on different types of leather. Those schemes may not go away because it's kind of consumer facing, and a lot of people use that to look at supply chain management in terms of their operations. But the LCA stuff for a lot of companies, I feel like a lot of companies have put this off for a bit. They focus a lot on greenhouse gas emission, which makes sense. California just passed two big laws, and we'll cover that later. But two big laws on greenhouse gas emission reporting by companies who sell product in California. So that obviously that tax with that. But the LCA point is a broadening look at the environment from ecosystems, from water, from these larger impacts that we typically haven't studied in footwear. And so it's a little bit daunting when you first look at it, but I think, Ashton, what we can say to folks is there are going to be a ton of firms, and some of them will be accounting firms that people already work with, that can put the reports together for this and will help companies do that. So yes, there is a cost, but there are experts. The challenge for companies is that they're going to have to mine the data themselves and start to collect that, correct? Like that's where we're at. It's like someone can help tell you, someone can write the report for you and make sure you comply with this. But ultimately, if you don't have data to provide to those firms, you're going to be kind of stuck. So I think it's kind of a warning flag where a lot of companies in the U.S. that sell product in Europe, they're not going to see, and the other thing we can talk to is the timeline, right? Like obviously large companies, publicly traded companies in Europe have to comply over the next year or two. Non-European companies that sell product in the European Union may not have to report until 2028. That may get pushed out. But with all this data set, if you're looking at a shoe and you got 60 different materials and you got 60 different SKUs out there per season, and you're just looking at that from a material perspective, not even, everything else, that's a lot of LCA information you have to start to collect sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that assessment. There are absolutely consulting firms forming around this idea of how to draft reports and how to put the reports together, but they can't do their work if the data is not there to begin with. And so companies are being expected to gather the data, mine the data, accumulate the data, and more specifically, they're expected to do that for the entire supply chain. A lot of past regulations are like, hey, you got to tell us what your scope 1 and 2 is, but scope 3, it's like voluntary or, there's no requirement around that. But in European Union, they're saying, hey, we want the entire value chain. So you've got to tell us, every component of your product, what are the impacts associated with that component? And you've got to understand that. You also mentioned, GRS and other standards that are out there. I think those will be a key part of the regime in the future. I just think the reason for their importance will change and shift, right? Because those also give traceability. Those, material accounting schemes allow you to have traceability through your supply chain, which is also a requirement of CSRD and other regulations. So it will be less about verifying a content and more about providing traceability of a product, where it came from, and an understanding of how raw materials are being sourced.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that in 2028, some U.S. companies may not have to worry about this until 2028. Um, that's only small and medium-sized companies that are only falling under CSRD due to the EU turnover test, which is, a test that basically says how much volume of sales are you creating. A lot of U.S. companies are going to have to be worrying about this a lot sooner than this. Some as early as 2024,
Okay.
which is 2 months away. So, this is a much closer reality than people realize. Most people are going to fall into the scheme between 2024 and 2026. And when I say 2024 and 2026, you're going to be reporting on what your business did in those years. So you'll generate, in 2024, you'll generate a 2025 annual report reflecting on 2024 data that needs to meet CSRD requirements.
Yeah.
Hey, Ashton, let me ask you this: we're all sitting in the U.S. and clearly we're talking about the European market. We know these things metastasize and move to the U.S., typically California and then beyond. How are you tracking that? How are you forecasting with your partners about what the impacts will be here stateside?
Yeah, it's not entirely clear to me yet because U.S. is very set on climate oriented. It's all about greenhouse gases, and we're just trying to catch up to reporting on greenhouse gases. So, what I will say is that my experience as an adult who pays attention to politics, and Andy can probably speak to this better than I can, is that the U.S. likes to put legislation in place when the legislation is no longer necessary. When in 60 to 70% of the industry is already there, then they put the legislation in place that says, hey, you need to be here. So, um, basically, with that in mind, I think the EU requirements will start to drive industry towards a goal of having LCA and having sustainability impacts being fully considered across all of the impact categories. Um, and as industry starts to become comfortable with that framework and starts to understand that framework, it's very likely that the U.S. will add similar legislation. But what the timing on that is, I mean, who knows?
There are considerations too that we have to look at when we're looking at policy, uh, both in the U.S. and European Union. We've had a pretty good run of economic growth, even with the ups and downs of COVID and all that. But we're seeing signs of a slowdown in Europe. We've got wars on Europe's borders, and so that will definitely influence as well, like how far the European Union will push. And that's why I always say, like, the time frames could shift. We don't know. It looks like they'll stay firm, but they could shift based on outside considerations. As we wrap up this conversation, we focus a lot on the quantitative. In terms of the qualitative, I think it's very important too to talk about that, because a lot of companies that we see out there who have launched product, kind of onesie twosie on the sustainability front, well, they'll grab a material here, grab a material there. Um, I feel like it's hitting the point where you can no longer just launch a unique sustainable product and market that, but you have to have a strategy to implementing sustainable materials, environmentally preferred materials and processes, or talking about what you're looking at with your impacts and how you're mitigating that. It could be, a uh, virtual purchase power agreement that you have for carbon credit or whatever that is, but you have to have something, I think. And I think, Ashton, that's going to be a big turning point too, because I think a lot of what people have done have gone to their suppliers. And again, this is where they'll go back to you guys in particular and say, we use Bloom in our product because it helps us reduce greenhouse gases, and as well as address like water issues, right? When you guys are pulling water, and actually it's the opposite of what most people are looking at, trying to decrease water impact, and you guys have a net positive where you clean waterways with your through your product. So I think that's an important part, that you're going to have to not only lean on suppliers and look at things from data sets, but also how you can help, how you can use them to tell you what's going to happen. But there's going to be a cost to this too. I mean, we all need to be prepared, because if you're going to implement strategy, it's going to cost more money, and obviously to report and do all the stuff there's going to be some cost in here. Hopefully not too high, but I think people just need to be aware of that. In particular, the strategy session.
I mean, a shameless plug real quick. There's always a cost to everything, but that's where engaging with commercial entities who are already delivering some of this benefits you, right? So, um, in terms of the qualitative statements, there's in the pollutions category, it's like, hey, what are you going to do with microplastics? What efforts are you putting forward to prevent microplastics? And, one of the things we talked about at the recent FDRA show is that, polyurethane is way more toxic than any other plastic out there from a microplastic standpoint. So, you know, part of your strategy can be shifting from one type of material to another type of material to reduce the overall toxicity. Part of your strategy can be shifting to a product that naturally restores water bodies, which is part of what they're asking you to do in the water and marine resources category. So part of the strategy can be built into just the products that you source. And obviously that has a cost as well, because innovation has cost, but it's not the same level of cost as having to just invest in, a water body cleanup effort, or invest in recapturing your raw materials to prevent microplastic emissions, or invest in, larger, more in-depth schemes to, address these issues that you're being asked to tackle.
Yeah. Well, folks, as we wrap up, I will say, FDRA is going to continue to lean into these regulatory issues. It seems to be coming at us fast and quick, almost like an avalanche of regulations. Some of it is the confusion comes around where, especially in Europe, because many people in the U.S. are not as familiar with the system that they have there. But a lot of it is just draft reports, comments, white papers that are submitted, and there might be an article that comes out. And if you get confused about whether it's actually a law, whether it's actually pertinent to your business, whether it's actually going to be implemented or a priority, you can always contact us, and we can help provide and guide you on those different conversations to help your business. But this is in particular a priority because it is law. There are rules out. You are going to have to start reporting. So you have to get your data house in order now, whether it's creating a team internally, you need to create like where you're going to put the data, whether it's PLM or something else. And you're going to have to start look at different consultants to help, maybe capture data, but for sure to report that information to bodies in this instance. So, and last point I'll say is we did a really great kind of webinar, working group meeting on LCA, where Ashton went through meticulously what a good LCA is and what it looks like and how to understand it. So if you missed that, we have that recorded. We can provide that to anyone who is a member and particularly interested to learn more about that. It's very important. And this is like where my professor he'd lean in over the desk and say, when I lean in over the desk, write this down because it'll be on the test. So I'm leaning over my desk and I'm saying it's very important your LCA is a good LCA, that the science is backed. It's by a third party. It's peer reviewed. There's some important qualifications. We cover that in that webinar. And so that's why I want to point that out. But Ashton, thanks for coming on today and kind of helping us shed some light on what's happening, what's coming, and helping people kind of get their house in order. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, folks, shoeandshow.com is our headquarters. We've got, close to 500 episodes on there now across the board on everything shoe business related. We appreciate you guys listening week after week on things that are important to the footwear industry and the strength of the industry. On behalf of Matt and the whole team, next week, new episode dropping. Make sure you subscribe, tell your friends, tell your family. And until next time, Shoe In is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.